Hey guys, tonight we're headed deep into the heart of 8th century China, where the Tang dynasty is at its bureaucratic peak. You're standing just inside the tall, lacquered gates of Chang'an, a city so vast it takes 2 days to cross by mule. And that's assuming your mule is motivated, which, honestly, most of them aren't. The scent of roasted chestnuts and dusty parchment lingers in the early morning air. Robed officials scurry past with stacks of documents. And up ahead, a scribe stares nervously at a dwindling pile of paper, each sheet precious and irreplaceable. You're about to witness something rare, a slow-burning panic, not over war, famine, or intrigue, but over a very mundane, deeply unglamorous threat. The empire is running low on paper, and not just low, perilously low. Not enough for the daily stream of court edicts, official petitions, poetry contests, astrology forecasts, tax ledgers, and the occasional anonymous complaint about someone stealing dumplings from the ministerial pantry. Yes, you probably wouldn't survive this crisis. Not because of the paper, exactly, but because functioning in this level of relentless administration without a stable stationery supply would break even the most hardened office worker. Imagine filing 5 separate forms just to request more ink, and then learning there's a separate form to request the request form. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in the outer courtyard of the Secretariat, watching a scribe nibble at the end of his brush. Not out of anxiety, though he has plenty, but because he's trying to make the ink last longer. A bead of sweat rolls down his temple as he squints at the remaining paper. Just 4 sheets. 4. And he still has to transcribe 2 edicts, 1 trade agreement, and a particularly long-winded poem that praises the emperor's eyebrows in 47 lines. The problem isn't a single missed shipment or a slightly reduced order from the mills. It's been coming for months. The empire has grown fat on words. Daily reports from governors, correspondence between departments, transcripts of the emperor's dreams, which are apparently required for astrological purposes. And all that ink has to go somewhere. But the paper mills in the south have fallen behind. Something about a lack of mulberry pulp. Or maybe it was too much rain. Or too little. Or possibly just lazy mill workers who've realized they can make more money brewing rice wine than pounding plant fibers. Historians still argue whether the shortage truly originated from agricultural failures, or if it was more a failure of logistics, slow caravans, poor inventory management, or just an empire whose appetite for documentation had finally outpaced its supply chains. Either way, what was once unthinkable has crept quietly into the halls of power. There may not be enough paper for every memo, edict, and poetic outburst. And in a world where written records are sacred, where not writing something down is nearly the same as not doing it. This is the kind of creeping dread that doesn't inspire riots or rebellion, but instead, a quiet, mounting tension. You follow one clerk into an inner chamber where an emergency meeting is underway. 5 senior scribes, each clutching a nearly spent brush, sit around a scroll-covered table, sipping weak tea and trying to sound calm. One proposes printing on both sides of the paper, a practice previously deemed inelegant. Another suggests switching from full-sized scrolls to folded folios, though this means redrawing the margins, and no one wants to be the person who redraws imperial margins. A third, clearly sleep-deprived, proposes recycling old memos. No one reads them anyway, he mutters. He's not entirely wrong. One of them pulls out a sliver of bamboo from his sleeve. Back to basics, he jokes. No one laughs. At this point, the panic hasn't reached the emperor. Yet. But it won't be long. And once the court notices, every scrap will be accounted for, every sheet weighed, and every poem about cherry blossoms deemed less than essential. You step outside again as a runner hurries past, clutching a sheaf of documents tied with a red ribbon. His sandals slap against the cobblestones, kicking up dust. He's on his way to the Grand Council. It's possible this very moment, this bundle of ink and paper, is the last full-length scroll to be submitted without restrictions. Tomorrow, it might need to be summarized, or worse, abbreviated. The palace cat watches him pass, unimpressed. In the market square, vendors murmur about the paper shortage, along with whispers of a new tax on brush bristles and rumors that someone tried to forge scroll paper out of pressed lotus leaves. It disintegrated on contact with ink, but points for creativity. At the edge of the city, a caravan is overdue. It was meant to bring 200 bolts of paper from the south, and there's quiet hope it simply got delayed by river flooding or stubborn oxen. You watch the guards scan the horizon, hoping for the telltale flutter of bundled parchment flapping on a merchant's cart. Nothing, just wind. So for now, you wait with the rest of the Tang court. Not in chaos, not yet, but in quiet anxiety. The kind that creeps in when a system built on paper suddenly realizes how delicate its foundations really are. You look up. Even the sky feels like it's holding its breath. You ease into the next morning with the smell of ink still clinging to your sleeves. The city of Chang'an stretches around you in its usual grand sprawl. Towering gates, humming marketplaces, horse carts creaking along wide avenues. But now you notice it everywhere. The subtle tightness, the unsaid worry, the way clerks clutch their document rolls just a bit more tightly, like someone might snatch them away at any moment. You follow a low-level official, someone whose job title translates loosely as Third Assistant Recorder of the 6th Ministerial Branch. It's not glamorous, but he walks with purpose, because today he's tasked with inventorying how many sheets of paper remain across his department's entire bureau. He holds a single half-sized folio in one hand. It's all he was given. He's writing very small. This is where it becomes clear. The Tang administration doesn't just use paper, it devours it. On a good day, the capital generates roughly 6,000 scrolls worth of documentation. Petitions, decrees, tax ledgers, legal decisions, warehouse logs, grain inventories, birth records, poetry anthologies, horoscopes, etiquette manuals, copies of etiquette manuals, and then multiple copies of those. You walk into a storage archive and the walls are lined, floor to ceiling, with scrolls wrapped in silk threads. It looks like a library married a curtain shop and gave birth to an anxious paper hoarder. A clerk gestures proudly at one stack. "This," he says, "is just last week's correspondence from Sichuan." You nod, not wanting to admit that you assumed it was a year's worth. At the height of the Tang dynasty, the imperial bureaucracy sprawls like a giant paper octopus, each tentacle reaching into every village, orchard, granary, and market. Every local magistrate must report up the chain. Every shipment must be documented. And heaven forbid a shipment of mandarins is off by half a jin. That's a form, with witnesses. Historians still argue whether the Tang bureaucracy was the most efficient or merely the most relentless in Chinese history. What's agreed on is this: it functioned only because of paper. Paper was its bloodstream. Without it, the administrative body begins to seize. You follow another official into the Ministry of Personnel. Here, paper is especially crucial, used to record promotions, demotions, merit points, and infractions as petty as sighing loudly during imperial lectures. One clerk flips through the records, looking for a junior officer's exam score. "It was here," he mutters. "I know it was here." You glance down. His ink has begun to bleed through the last few sheets. The paper is thin, too thin. A stack nearby is visibly warped from humidity. You pick one up, and it flakes slightly in your hand, like ancient pastry. Not ideal. Outside, you pass a scholar clutching a scroll wrapped tightly in red silk. His name is Lin, and he's been waiting 6 days for an audience to present his latest thesis on the virtue of imperial sleep schedules. It's 47 pages long, written in neat brush script. But now, with rumors of scroll rationing, he's begun second-guessing. Should he trim it down? Remove the section where he compares the emperor's sleep to the phases of the moon? He opens the scroll, then quickly rolls it back up, as if exposing it to the air might waste ink. Elsewhere in the city, you pass a vendor who's cleverly pivoted his market stall. Once a humble calligraphy ink seller, he now offers paper consultation services. For a small fee, he'll evaluate your script layout and recommend ways to fit more characters per square inch without sacrificing dignity. You listen in as he advises a nervous-looking poet. Go slanted, he says. Diagonal lines. Very trendy. Very economical. Use seal script. Less ink per stroke. The poet nods, overwhelmed, and fumbles for his purse. Meanwhile, the palace archive is starting to feel the pinch. Traditionally, the vault of all imperial documents, records of births, deaths, treaties, battles, and everything in between, it has started sending polite inquiries to other departments asking if they really need to submit 4 copies of each report. No one is quite sure what to do with this information. Reduce documentation? Submit only 2 copies? That borders on heresy, and yet the bureaucracy cannot pause. Every day still brings decisions to be made, appeals to be reviewed, court drama to be logged. You walk past an official court scribe who's been tasked with recording a dispute between 2 minor nobles over the rightful ownership of a particularly flattering mirror. He sighs as he unfurls a small sheet, muttering, "Not wasting a full scroll on this." You keep walking. Down an alley, you stumble on a line of servants haggling over recycled paper scraps. Pages once used for astrology predictions are now being scrubbed clean and resold. One man clutches a tattered sheet with faint outlines of constellations still visible behind his newly written marriage contract. Adds a touch of destiny, he says proudly. A child nearby is folding what little paper he has left into tiny birds. They're good luck, he says, especially now. His mother winces but doesn't stop him. Back in the secretariat, your clerk friend finally sits down to tally his report. Today's count, he writes, 18 full scrolls, 7 half scrolls, 1 emergency folio, and 6 questionable sheets with unknown stains. He doesn't elaborate. He signs it at the bottom, still dry for now, and just as he sets down the brush, a low-ranking messenger bursts through the door, breathless. The Emperor has noticed, he says. Everyone goes still. The room, thick with the smell of ink and candle smoke, suddenly feels colder. The scribes glance at each other. No one speaks. And you realize, quite suddenly, that tomorrow's to-do list will begin with something unprecedented. Figure out how to tell the Son of Heaven that his empire is almost out of paper. You wake up to the sound of brushes scratching frantically across parchment, and the soft creak of wooden stools as palace scribes shift, hunched over their desks. Dawn in Chang'an is usually gentle, but this morning carries a certain edge, as if even the wind knows it's in trouble. The scribe you followed yesterday is already at work, cramming 3 full memorials onto 1 scroll by turning it sideways and writing in columns barely wider than a toothpick. There's a whispered rumor that someone over at the Ministry of Rights managed to fit an entire land grant on the back of a rice receipt. Another copied an imperial edict onto the inside of a fan. Functional and fashionable, though perhaps not very permanent. You sidestep a passing eunuch balancing an awkward stack of paper scraps in both arms. Some are cut unevenly, others still smudged with old ink. The man doesn't slow down. He's headed to the Department of Astronomy. where even star charts now have to be drawn on the backs of last month's Moon Festival invitations. You make your way into a small side room tucked between two storage halls. Inside, 3 senior scribes sit in solemn silence, surrounded by boxes of rejected parchment. Bent, stained, irregular. Today's task: sort, smooth, salvage. One scribe sighs as he runs a dry cloth across a water-streaked sheet. "This once held a poem about plum blossoms," he murmurs. "Now it'll hold a fish tax report. You offer to help," gently pressing the sheet flat under a warm stone. There's a strange intimacy to this process. Handling paper that's been handled before, watching old ink fade beneath new purpose. Historians still argue whether this creative reuse was purely pragmatic or whether it marked a philosophical turn toward transience, humility, or simply exhaustion. What's certain is that scribes across Chang'an have become resourceful in ways they never imagined. In a corner, a junior scribe sits at a narrow desk, squinting as he sharpens his brush to the finest point possible. "Small script saves paper," he says, "but also causes headaches." You glance at the parchment he's filling. It looks less like handwriting and more like a trail of insect legs crawling down the scroll. He offers you a look of resigned pride. "I wrote an entire census report using 5 characters per square inch." He holds up his callus-ridden hand. Also lost all feeling in these fingers. Despite the constraints, the workload hasn't slowed. If anything, it's worse. Departments are now required to submit abbreviated versions of every report, plus a short justification for why they deserve more paper next week. That's 2 scrolls instead of 1. Maybe not the best solution. The court's famous etiquette manuals are the first to be trimmed. Where once they contained elaborate diagrams for folding one's robes at court banquets, now they simply say, "Try not to look disheveled." A small victory for brevity. Elsewhere, the artistic community is not coping quite as well. You pass a group of young poets in a tea house, sipping bitter brews and grumbling. "I had to write my love poem on birch bark," one complains. "It gave her a splinter." Another shrugs. "I mailed mine carved into dried lotus leaves. Romantic, but it smelled like soup." There's even a whispered joke going around. "How do you write a haiku during a paper shortage?" Answer: you don't. Yet even amid the frustration, innovation creeps in. Some scribes are experimenting with ink made from soot and old tea leaves. It smells faintly of burnt toast and jasmine, but it works. Others try mirror writing, reversing their text so that it can be read only in reflection, doubling the mystery, if not the meaning. One old scholar, determined not to sacrifice quality, begins using his silk handkerchiefs as impromptu pages. "The fabric holds the brush strokes beautifully," he explains, "and I was never fashionable anyway." You walk past the main copy hall, where the energy has changed entirely. Normally a quiet hum of steady labor. Today it buzzes with the strange sound of hushed efficiency. The scribes work quickly, but carefully, eyes scanning each inch of parchment before making a single stroke. They've begun using faint grid lines now, lightly drawn with string and powdered charcoal to guide their lettering. Mistakes can't be afforded. There is no extra copy. Each word must count. Each brushstroke must matter. It's oddly inspiring. You watch as one clerk completes a 2-page summary of an entire trade route negotiation with just 120 characters. Another condenses a legal ruling down to a single, perfectly phrased paragraph. It's like watching bureaucratic poetry. You glance at a young assistant rolling up a completed scroll with near reverence. He wraps it in old cloth, seals it with beeswax, and places it gently in a worn basket lined with cotton. "I used to hate paperwork," he says, "but now I kind of admire it." Even the more cynical scribes have started to appreciate the challenge. "It's like dieting," one jokes, but with words. And through it all, a peculiar sort of pride begins to take root. not pride in opulence or abundance, but in making do, in finding form inside constraint, in proving that even without fresh parchment, the imperial court can still function, just maybe with smaller handwriting and the occasional lotus-scented memo. As evening falls, the halls grow quiet again. A final delivery boy makes his rounds, distributing tomorrow's allocations. 3 sheets per office, 5 for the secretariat, 1 half scroll for emergencies. He slips a sliver of parchment under each door. It's barely larger than your hand, and yet you feel it. The strange reverence, the weight of a single blank sheet, so full of potential, so fragile, so rare. You hold it up to the fading lantern light, and somewhere behind you, a scribe whispers, half joking, "Guard it with your life." The scroll arrives early, thin, brittle, and carried with the same care usually reserved for precious jade or high-grade tea. It's addressed directly to the Hall of State Affairs, and even before the silk tie is loosened, everyone knows what it is. The Emperor has noticed. You're there as it's unrolled, very slowly, because it's so fragile, it could tear from an overly eager tug. The calligraphy is tight, elegant, and unmistakably imperial. The edict begins with 3 words, a matter grave. Not urgent, not dire, just grave. A very Tang sort of panic, measured, stately, laced with ceremonial calm. The edict doesn't scold, not exactly. Instead, it frames the paper shortage as a moral and philosophical matter. The Emperor writes that the heavens provide ink to those who speak with purpose, and hints, ever so gently, that perhaps too many words have flowed without need. You can practically hear 100 officials gulp in unison. And then comes the decree. Effective immediately, all departments must reduce non-essential written communication by 1/3. Memorials are to be shortened, duplicates restricted, and poetry competitions, brace yourself, postponed until further notice. You would think a meteor had hit the Poetry Bureau. The edict also calls for inventive stewardship, which is emperor speak for figure it out yourselves, but make it look wise. It ends with a poetic flourish about the ink brush being mightier than the sword, only when wielded with restraint. It's very literary, and also clearly the work of someone who hasn't tried to summarize a land dispute in fewer than 50 characters. Still, the response is immediate. You walk with a senior administrator, robes swishing at twice their usual speed, as he storms into the records office. "New format," he barks. "Petitions must now fit on half scrolls. Use the backs if you must, and no more hand-drawn embellishments. This is not the Spring Festival." In the copy halls, artists who once delighted in beautiful headers and ornamental dragons are now gently told their services are temporarily unnecessary. One calligrapher sulks as he erases a particularly lovely cloud motif from a border. "It had movement," he insists. Meanwhile, in the Hall of Histories, scholars begin combing through old archives to find precedents for paper crises. One excited intern finds a footnote from the Han Dynasty referencing a shortage of silk scrolls during a flood year. It's enough to spark a flurry of memos, on borrowed paper naturally, arguing over whether this is technically a repeat scenario or an unprecedented administrative emergency. Historians still argue whether the emperor's edict was a masterstroke of early crisis management or simply an attempt to appear poetic while doing nothing concrete. What they agree on is that the language was vague enough to allow every department to interpret it differently, and that's exactly what happens. Over in the Ministry of Punishments, reduced writing means using single characters for entire crimes. One ledger now reads, theft, bribery, fish, misconduct, arson. No one is quite sure what fish means, but it sounds serious. In the Court of Music, they try to translate their performances into shorthand notations, which turns out to be surprisingly complicated. One frustrated musician holds up a score and sighs, "How do you abbreviate melancholy yearning with a single character?" You pass a group of clerks standing in line at the ink counter. The mood is strangely cheerful. "At least we're finally free from inspirational preambles," one says. "No more 3-paragraph introductions to say, 'Fix the bridge.'" His friend nods. "I just wrote, 'Bridge broken, repair soon.'" So efficient, so satisfying. But not everyone is adjusting smoothly. The Palace Department of Rituals, which usually prints out prayer schedules, moon phases, and an exhaustive monthly guide to favorable haircut dates, has come to a complete halt. One monk stares at a blank scroll and mutters, "How can we schedule offerings without noting the footnotes on goose alignment?" In the Department of Taxation, scribes are instructed to combine households into group reports. The results are chaotic. You glance at a scroll listing 3 families' incomes, livestock, crop yields, and marital disputes, all mushed into one paragraph. The Lee family owes 1 rooster and partial oats. The Jangs report mildew in the eastern field, and Mr. Sun is refusing to marry the widow again. Succinct? Yes. Clear? No. You stop by a tiny pavilion just off the court walkway. It's quiet here. A young woman sits cross-legged, carefully trimming the edges off old scrolls to create narrow writing slips. Around her, a small pile of confetti-like paper curls collects. She's part of the Reprocessing Initiative, a new program encouraging departments to scavenge their own archives. She smiles at you. "I found an old shipment log from 701. The ink's faded, but the backs are clean. It's like a second chance for parchment." You sit beside her for a moment. Watch as she gently flattens each sheet with a smooth river stone, then stacks them into neat bundles. Each one is tied with string made from old robe threads. Everything reused. Nothing wasted. That night, you wander the palace corridors. There's less rustling, fewer scrolls passed from hand to hand. But in the stillness, something else emerges. A sort of quiet respect for the page. A sense that writing, when limited, becomes more deliberate. You pass a scribe drafting an appeal. He pauses after every word, reads it aloud, edits with care. His ink dish is nearly dry, but he doesn't rush. Every stroke matters, and though the halls aren't exactly peaceful, they are, perhaps for the first time in years, no longer drowning in paper. The sun rises over Chang'an in a buttery gold haze, but inside the palace walls, the mood is about as delicate as the last few sheets of hemp paper left in storage. You're seated cross-legged in a corner of the Ministry of Rights, watching 3 red-faced officials argue over whether silk should be considered a dignified alternative to paper, or an insult to the entire bureaucratic apparatus. "Silk scrolls were once the standard," one insists, wagging his brush. "The sages used them. The ancients sang their praises." "Yes, well," his colleague sighs, rubbing his temples. "The ancients also didn't have 47 tax ledgers and 9 wedding permits to issue before breakfast." And so begins the desperate return to old methods. If paper is scarce, maybe the empire can lean back on what came before. Bamboo slips, silk panels, carved wood paddles, and the occasional inscribed gourd, if you're feeling whimsical. You follow a delegation of mid-ranking officials to a dusty corner of the city, where the last bamboo slip workshop still stands. It's been operating in obscurity for decades, mostly producing ceremonial items and tourist trinkets. But today, the place is bustling. Apprentices are dragging bundles of fresh-cut bamboo through the yard, splitting and shaving them into long, smooth strips. A soft tapping fills the air as characters are carved into wood using thin metal chisels. It's oddly musical, like a xylophone made of bureaucratic dread. You try writing on one of the slips yourself. It's heavier than parchment, obviously, and the spacing is unforgiving. There's no room for flourishes, metaphors, or the court's beloved 4-line proverbs about harmonious governance. It's blunt, clear, and utterly charm-free. Still, it gets the job done. Historians still argue whether this bamboo revival was a romantic nod to tradition or simply a last-ditch attempt to keep communication flowing. Either way, it's clumsy and slow. A single scroll's worth of text might take 12 slips, each tied together with silk thread. Not ideal for portable wisdom. Over at the Silk Merchants' Quarter, things are no less complicated. Silk, for all its elegance, was never meant to be disposable. The palace has quietly issued requisitions for raw, undyed panels, but the prices are soaring. One merchant proudly tells you that yesterday's temple budget report is now someone's new robe lining. "Waste not," he says, shrugging. Of course, using silk as stationery comes with its own hazards. Ink spreads differently, the brush catches more easily, and folding a silk document risks looking like you're sending laundry instructions to the emperor. And heaven forbid someone spills tea on it. It wicks like a sponge. Still, it hasn't stopped the truly desperate. You peek into a side hall of the Ministry of Personnel and catch an assistant scribbling performance reviews directly onto an old curtain. It's not even silk, just heavily starched cotton. But he's making it work. "It's a very disciplined weave," he mutters, as if that explains everything. Elsewhere in the city, creativity blooms in strange corners. One artisan begins selling repurposed lacquerware slates, onto which officials can write with chalk or soft soapstone. "Just wipe and reuse," he explains, smiling. "Perfect for drafting and insults." He winks. But maybe not for treaties. Even clay makes a brief return. At the edge of the southern district, you watch an old potter form flat tablets and hand them off to junior scribes, who press characters into them with sticks. The result is lumpy, heavy, and deeply satisfying to hold. Of course, storing messages in baked mud makes filing awkward, and there's something undignified about needing a cart to carry a memo. Back at the palace, one particularly enterprising department experiments with spoken reports. No written documents, just carefully rehearsed speeches delivered at the weekly council meetings. It goes poorly. The Minister of Revenue forgets half of his trade update, and when asked to clarify tax figures simply says, "More than last year, less than next." Not helpful. And then there's the silk ribbon debacle. In a fit of innovation, a junior court artist suggests using narrow strips of silk ribbon for messages. Tiny, elegant, and rollable. The idea catches on until someone ties the ribbons too tightly, and an entire week's worth of diplomatic communiques arrive looking like a bundle of festive dumplings. One ambassador mistakes it for a birthday gift. Chaos ensues. Through it all, you walk among the chaos with a sort of detached calm. There's something comforting, in a way, about watching an enormous bureaucratic machine try to reinvent itself under pressure. Like watching an elephant learn ballet. Awkward, strange, and kind of impressive when it doesn't fall over. You pass the poetry bureau, now eerily quiet. The poets have taken to writing haiku on river stones, then stacking them in the garden for passers-by to admire. You stoop to read one. Ink has grown silent. Paper dreams of bamboo roots. The brush waits alone. A little melodramatic, but not wrong. The sun dips behind the palace roofs as you climb the steps to a viewing terrace. Below you, the city pulses on. Less loud, less cluttered, but still functioning. Somehow, you think of all the strange writing surfaces you've seen today. Bamboo, silk, curtain fabric, river stones, lacquer slates. And amid the absurdity, there's something beautiful in it. A civilization not giving up, but improvising. One sheet at a time. And as you close your eyes for the evening, you wonder if, somewhere deep in the scroll archives, there's still a pristine sheet waiting, hidden between two dusty volumes, crisp, blank, and perfect. Just in case. You start the next morning inside the storerooms of the Ministry of Archives, where the head cataloger, a man with a beard so long it practically needs its own filing cabinet, has initiated a grand campaign. Scroll Consolidation Week. The motto, proudly stamped on a salvaged paper banner, reads, "Less scroll, more soul." You shadow a clerk as he opens boxes filled with dozens of single-purpose documents, tax records for a single orchard, permit renewals for sedan chair rentals, a 3-line list of disreputable musicians. One by one, these are scrutinized, bundled, and rewritten in tighter, abbreviated form on whatever parchment scraps are still available. It's a scene of bureaucratic triage. Scrolls once considered sacred are now reduced to summary notes and margin scribbles. If it wasn't important enough to be remembered, the head cataloger says with a shrug, it probably wasn't important enough to be written in the first place. You gently lift a scroll from the pile, fraying at the edges, its ink faded to a soft sepia. It's a petition from a village elder asking for permission to construct a new goat bridge. It's signed by 16 neighbors and includes a modest poem about the importance of sturdy hooves. Beautiful, utterly unnecessary. In the adjacent room, a group of junior archivists are working with extraordinary focus. Their job? Overwrite old documents with new content using a technique borrowed from Buddhist scribes, scraping away the ink from outdated scrolls to reuse the paper underneath. The result is palimpsest, a ghost of the past lingering beneath the present. You lean in and examine a newly recycled scroll. The current memo is a grain allocation report, but behind it, barely visible, is the tale of a monk who saw a dragon in a rice field. It's like the empire is whispering to itself through layers of forgotten ink. Historians still argue whether this sudden spike in palimpsests led to any significant loss of knowledge. Some believe priceless poetry and ancestral records vanished forever beneath logistics memos. Others suggest that very little was truly lost, only the extraneous, the overwrought, and the excessively sentimental. And the excessively sentimental was something the Tang dynasty had in excess. Meanwhile, a more unexpected concern arises. The ink. All this repurposing, trimming, and condensing is forcing scribes to use brushes more frequently and more aggressively. Supplies of traditional ink, made from pine soot and animal glue, are beginning to dwindle. The scent of burnt wood is ever present now, drifting from small ink factories that have hastily sprung up in alleyways and temple courtyards. One ink master you meet is stirring a fresh batch in a copper pot, muttering about the proper viscosity of bureaucratic ink. His assistant adds a handful of dried orange peel. For fragrance, he claims, so the ledgers smell of citrus and confidence. Elsewhere in the city, officials begin sharing ink blocks like prized heirlooms. You see one scribe snap his in half to lend it to a colleague. "I trust you," he says solemnly, like he's just handed over his firstborn child. In the marketplace, clever vendors capitalize on the crisis. One sells emergency scribe kits, complete with a thumbnail-sized ink cake, a quarter of a brush, and a folded paper slip barely big enough to write, "Help." Another stall offers dried leaves stitched together into makeshift writing pads. "Not elegant," the merchant admits, "but the ink doesn't bleed." Much. Back at the Hall of Records, someone floats the idea of verbal notary. In this experimental system, minor declarations and decisions are recorded orally, with witnesses, and sealed using stamped wooden tokens. These are then stored in labeled clay jars, each tied with a string that corresponds to a logbook. You watch as a clerk drops one such token into a jar labeled "Small Disputes, Livestock." It lands with a clink among a dozen others. "Efficient?" someone asks. "Confusing," another replies, "but definitely efficient." You wander through a courtyard where an artist sits sketching portraits of court ministers on reused paper. He tells you he once painted elaborate scroll illustrations for noble weddings, but now takes commissions from scribes who miss their own faces. "People want to remember who they were before the shortage," he says, tapping his brush against the paper thoughtfully. It's strange to think of an identity crisis being sparked not by war or rebellion, but by a lack of paper. You make your way to a pavilion overlooking the Lotus Pond, where a few mid-level officials are meeting. Unofficially, they're planning something ambitious, a temporary return to oral tradition for village-level communication. Like the bards of old, one says with a faint smile, only slightly more bureaucratic. The plan is simple, if optimistic. Roving scribe liaisons will be trained to memorize short reports and repeat them verbatim at court. It's basically human paperwork. There's skepticism and snickering, but the desperation is real enough to give the idea traction. The test run features a trial by memory. One brave soul must recite the week's river trade figures without a scroll. He makes it halfway through before forgetting the amount of wheat shipped from Lucho. It was either 4,000 or 14,000 bushels, he offers sheepishly. One of those. Evening sets in. You pass through the corridors lit by soft lantern light, where whispers now take the place of scribbled messages. Notes are exchanged on the backs of receipts, the margins of temple rubbings, even the edges of map fragments. You watch one scribe nod in understanding, then write a simple character on a scrap of cloth. Enough. Enough paper for today, enough worry for the moment. You close your eyes, listening to the hushed rustle of brushes, the muted tapping of bamboo slips being tied into bundles, and the soft, rhythmic breath of an empire trying, against all odds, to keep itself written into being. By now, the city hums with a different rhythm, a kind of cautious elegance born from scarcity. You wake up to the sound of clattering wood blocks, a sound you've begun to associate with ingenuity rather than desperation. You're standing inside the Bureau of Standards, where today's experiment involves printing entire messages using movable wood type. Yes, it's absurd. Yes, it's wildly inefficient for single documents. But also, yes, it works. Sort of. You watch as clerks lay out characters, one by one, onto wooden boards, each letter carved by hand. The messages aren't grand. No imperial decrees or philosophical treatises here. Just humble announcements, crop quotas, fish market regulations, and an extremely detailed schedule for latrine maintenance in the southern quarter. All vital in their own way. The head of the bureau beams with pride. Printing is the future, he proclaims, while brushing sawdust off his robe. Eventually we'll be so efficient we won't need any scribes. The scribes behind him do not look amused. One particularly grumpy clerk mutters, "He's been saying that since plum blossom season," while trying to reassemble the word for fertilizer from 4 mismatched wooden tiles. The piece for fertilizer keeps flipping upside down. Symbolic, perhaps. Outside, you cross paths with a group of young students from the Imperial Academy. They shuffle quietly along the boulevard, notebooks clutched protectively to their chests like sacred texts. The head scholar has instructed them to write their essays vertically down their sleeves. Ink-stained robes now flutter like silent scrolls. "We are the text," one boy whispers solemnly, before tripping on his hem. You walk past an open courtyard where a master storyteller is gathering a crowd. This is the newest interim solution: public storytelling. Instead of circulating news on paper, announcements are delivered verbally each morning, complete with dramatic pauses and mild exaggeration. "Let it be known," the man proclaims, "that the eastern bridge will be closed for repairs, due to a suspiciously determined turtle." The crowd gasps and chuckles. It's unclear whether this is true or simply the performer's flourish, but either way, the message spreads. It works. In a city trained to memorize poems and etiquette codes from childhood, oral tradition comes surprisingly naturally. Messages passed by voice, phrase by phrase, twist into mnemonics, jingles, and whispered retellings. Of course, problems arise when details change mid-transmission. A note about firewood quotas in outer districts quickly becomes outer districts on fire, and before anyone can correct the rumor, 5 men with buckets show up at the wrong gate. It's not flawless, but it's spirited. You make your way to the outskirts of the palace compound, where a side chamber now serves as the new experimental communications lab. The walls are covered with discarded silk strips, failed parchment experiments, and one truly bold attempt to transcribe tax records onto pressed mulberry bark. Spoiler, too bumpy. One clerk, wide-eyed from lack of sleep and too much tea, excitedly shows you his latest idea: microtext. He's attempting to condense entire regional reports onto sheets the size of a rice cake by using a magnifying glass and an uncomfortably sharp brush. "It's all here," he says, holding up a speckled dot. "All of Henan. You pretend to see something." He beams with pride. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine innovation or just caffeine-induced madness. Either way, the idea was shelved when 2 officials developed what was later called scholar's squint, a condition requiring them to read all future scrolls while lying on their sides. Nearby, a slightly more practical innovation gains traction: rolling ledgers. These are scrolls so long and narrow they resemble ribbons more than documents, meant to be wound tightly and reused for multiple entries. They're not elegant, but they use half the material of traditional forms. You spot one official flipping through his ledger like a deck of cards, stopping at a note labeled Grain Inspector Dispute Nr. 4. Another reads, Cow Stampede Incident. Not our jurisdiction. Minimalist reporting at its finest. Back in the main scribal halls, the old guard grumbles. One elder with a brush, the width of a fan handle, refuses to adjust. "I will not write in miniature," he says flatly. "I will not abbreviate. And I will not document official grievances on cabbage leaves." He waves a leaf. Even if it is quite crisp. His apprentice, however, is more open-minded. She's begun experimenting with eggshell writing, etching characters with a fine needle and sealing them with lacquer. "Not for daily use," she admits, "but good for love letters or passive-aggressive poetry." Elsewhere in the city, monks have begun using chanting as a record-keeping tool. They memorize sequences of events and sing them in rhythmic patterns. You attend one such session and listen as a group solemnly intones a full month's grain deliveries to the tune of a funeral dirge. It's oddly moving and surprisingly accurate. Still, not everyone trusts the ephemeral nature of sound. One clerk suggests writing in sand and photographing it, before realizing that cameras won't be invented for about 1,000 years. He sighs and goes back to drafting letters on leaves. You pass a small private residence where a retired scribe is running what he calls paper lending services. He rents out half-used scrolls to young scholars at a discounted rate, provided they return them within the week and don't write anything indecent. One boy returns a scroll shyly. "I only use the corner," he says. The old man beams. Excellent margins. And finally, you find yourself standing outside the Imperial Library, a quiet, stone-walled building that has, remarkably, remained untouched during the paper crisis. The doors creak open slowly, and inside, cool air greets your face like a sigh. Here, amid rows of carefully wrapped scrolls and sealed chests, is a single locked drawer labeled Emergency Reserve. Its key is said to hang around the neck of the chief archivist, who hasn't smiled since winter. No one opens it, not yet. But every so often, someone walks past, slows down, and just runs their fingers across the drawer's edge. As if touching it might help. As if a final backup scroll is all that stands between the Empire and unreadable silence. This morning, you follow the faint smell of burnt rice and hot glue to a courtyard behind the Imperial kitchens. Not the usual site for bureaucratic innovation, But desperation breeds creativity in strange corners. A group of chefs and scribes have teamed up to create a new paper substitute. The ingredients? Cooked rice, mulberry pulp, and crushed lotus petals. The result? A sort of beige, slightly fragrant parchment that crinkles like stale dumpling wrappers. You run your fingers over a finished sheet. It's surprisingly smooth. It bends, but doesn't tear. When someone brushes ink across it, the characters hold, though they do smell faintly of porridge. A cook beams. Who knew the secret to saving the Tang bureaucracy was leftover kanji? The experiment goes well until one of the palace cats eats a corner of the scroll. A scribe sighs. At least now we know it's biodegradable. Elsewhere, resourcefulness is becoming a kind of quiet competition. You sit in on a briefing between two provincial delegates. Both are trying to impress the court with their conservation methods. One presents a chart drawn on bark. The other brings a fish skin parchment, carefully cleaned, dried, and cured with salt. Durable, he says, handing it to you. You nod. It's slightly translucent and still smells faintly of river. This one held a shipping report, he adds, and the recipe for pickled radish. We ran out of space. At the Ministry of Agriculture, the scribes are using old seed catalogs as draft paper. We just write between the pictures, one mutters. Surely no one needs to see all 30 types of millet. In the background, someone chuckles. Don't tell the millet enthusiast. There is, of course, a millet enthusiast. He has very strong opinions about font size. Historians still argue whether this burst of low-tech solutions marked the beginning of Tang pragmatism or the collapse of Tang aesthetics. Either way, it is undeniably working. The empire stumbles forward. You pause in a market square where a crowd has gathered. A man in blue robes is auctioning off antique paper from his family shrine. Unused ancestral offering scrolls, he proclaims, fanning them out like fine silks. Blank, blessed, and slightly singed at the corners. People bid with tea bricks and preserved plums. The winning buyer walks away, cradling the stack like a newborn child. Back in the court, the mood has shifted. There's less panic now. Just a worn-in acceptance that nothing will go back to how it was. Paper is no longer taken for granted. You watch a scribe brush one character at a time, pausing after each stroke. He mouths the words before writing, as if saying them aloud will make them more deliberate. There's beauty in this new slowness, a kind of reverence. You stop by the poetry hall again. It's quieter than before, but not empty. A few poets sit under a plum tree, taking turns composing lines aloud, then carving them into the bark with blunt knives. The trunk is now covered in verse, its knotted skin like a book you have to walk around to read. One stanza catches your eye. Pages may vanish, but still the wind carries words, soft and slow and free. You find yourself smiling. Down the hall, a meeting is underway. A group of high-ranking ministers is discussing what they're calling the new documentation protocol, which is bureaucratic for how to make less paperwork look intentional. A draft of the new policy is passed around on a stitched patchwork scroll. It's made from 5 different paper types, 1 silk backing, and a strip of laundry parchment bearing what might have once been a recipe for duck sauce. The core message is clear. Summarize more, duplicate less, prioritize only what the emperor might actually read. Someone suggests banning metaphors in tax reports. Another proposes turning old records into historical compost. A third, clearly in a bold mood, asks if every department really needs to issue weekly reports. The room goes still. Then someone nods, then someone else. It's happening. In a darkened alcove, the imperial court artist is quietly drawing emergency scroll lines on reusable parchment with charcoal ink that can be wiped clean. A fresh stack of these reusable pages sits under a cloth marked "Do Not Eat." You don't ask why that warning was necessary. Further afield, villagers have begun using papyrus-like reeds soaked and pressed into panels. Crude, yes, but also charming. You pass one man delivering a tax report inscribed on 3 onion peels. "My writing stinks," he says, "but it's legible. Even the children have caught on." A group of them plays a game where they pretend to be officials, writing notes on tiles, leaves, or each other's sleeves. You spot a boy with the word urgent scribbled across his forehead in charcoal. "I'm the emperor," he declares. "I demand 3 carrots and a nap." Honestly, not a bad policy platform. Evening descends again. You sit in a quiet courtyard, lit by fireflies and a single lantern. Someone nearby is reciting a document aloud, repeating it until it becomes more rhythm than message. A gentle breeze stirs, a bird chirps in the distance. The paper may be thin, short, or strange now, but the words somehow endure. Etched in memory, whispered between friends, scratched into bark, inked onto cloth, the empire is adapting. Not perfectly, not cleanly, but with humor, with quiet grit. With the knowledge that sometimes a crisis just means you find better ways to say what matters. And sometimes it just means writing on fish skin. You rise the next day to a sky the color of old parchment. Fitting, really, considering today's task. You've been summoned to attend a special session in the Hall of Records, where the scribes have begun a grand experiment. The classification of scrolls into essential, important, and sentimental. This is harder than it sounds. The essential category is easy. Tax records, water management updates, border reports. Important includes things like royal decrees, judicial decisions, and grain storage ledgers. But sentimental? That's the gray zone. That's where bureaucracy meets poetry. That's where it gets messy. You're watching a trio of scholars huddle over a scroll titled, "A Brief History of the Palace Window Hinges." One wants to keep it. "We might need it if repairs are ever required." Another says, "Burn it." There's not a single metaphor or moral lesson in here. The third gently rolls it up and places it in the sentimental pile. It's just nice, and that becomes the unspoken rule for sentimental scrolls. If it made someone smile, it stays. You move from table to table. One clerk clutches a draft of his first ever court petition and refuses to let it be recycled. Another rereads a scribbled recipe for plum wine with tears in his eyes. Someone else discovers a 5-year-old poem about ducks in the rain, annotated in the margins with alternate quacking sounds. It is, apparently, a masterpiece. In one corner, 2 junior officials are giggling over a love note written in code between an astrologer and a librarian. It's disguised as a table of lunar eclipse dates, but the pattern reveals the message. Meet me where scrolls go to dream. Romantic, cryptic, very Tang. Elsewhere in the hall, a separate team is attempting to tally just how much paper has been saved through consolidation efforts. You listen in as one clerk mutters, 37 scrolls reduced to 6, 62 ledgers now fit in a single pouch. Then he pauses, looks around, and sighs. And yet I still can't find my lunch permit. Historians still argue whether this sentimental cataloging was an act of bureaucratic indulgence or a rare moment of collective humanity. But as you watch an old scribe run his fingers over the edges of a faded scroll, eyes distant, it's clear that these papers are more than records. They're memories in ink. Outside, the recycling office, yes, it's now an official bureau, is in full swing. Teams of workers sort through old documents to find usable scraps, binding them into what they call patch scrolls. Each one is a Frankenstein's monster of prior memos, folded pages and blank margins sewn together with thread dyed from red ink sediment. One supervisor laughs as she holds up a patch scroll. This one has a fishing license on one side and a weather forecast from last month on the other. Now it's going to carry next week's market report. That's called multi-generational bureaucracy. A new initiative is also gaining ground. The Scroll Exchange. It's like a lending library, except instead of books, People bring in excess blank pages, if they have them, or partially used scrolls to trade. The rules are simple. If you don't need the bottom half, someone else probably does. You peek over a clerk's shoulder as he negotiates. "I've got 3 inches of unused commentary space," he offers. "We'll trade for 1 decree header and a ½ inch of ceremonial blessing margin." They shake hands. Trade complete. Back in the poets' quarter, creativity blooms under pressure. Poets begin composing in shorter forms, haiku, riddles, 2-character punchlines, and chalk them onto walls, pillars, even the backs of chairs. You sit on one such chair and find this written underneath. No paper? No problem. Words wait. In the foreign merchants district, a visiting trader from Samarkand offers an intriguing alternative. Palm leaf manuscripts. He shows a sample, delicate but sturdy, etched with narrow styluses. Popular in the south, he explains, and naturally resistant to mildew. The Tang officials nod, then whisper furiously about whether mildew resistance counts as culturally harmonious. Another proposal floats in from Korea. Pressed seaweed parchment. Lightweight, flexible, and vaguely salty to the touch. A curious official tastes it and declares, functional and snackable. The sample is later declared missing. You meander into a modest chamber near the emperor's private quarters. Here, a few trusted eunuchs are maintaining the whisper log, a daily, spoken-only update delivered directly to His Majesty. The rule is simple. You must memorize your message, deliver it flawlessly, and never write it down. You watch one official rehearse in front of a mirror, pacing slowly. 7 crates of rice diverted, bridge stable. 1 goose elected unofficial mascot of the Southern Watchtower. It's oddly theatrical. There's applause when he finishes. Someone hands him a ginger candy. At day's end, you wander through the Court of Seals, where every document still must be stamped. Here, the stampers are now being trained to work on new materials. Bark, cloth, silk, even the occasional pressed gourd. The court seal, once reserved for the finest parchment, is now pressed into the strangest of surfaces. You watch as a clerk seals a tax record onto the belly of a dried squash. "Odd," she murmurs, "but official." That night, the city is quieter than usual. Fewer scrolls rustle, fewer brushes scrape, but the words haven't stopped. They just take stranger paths now. You lean against a warm stone wall as a breeze carries the smell of ink and steamed buns. A scribe hums while slicing a half-used scroll into neat strips. Another dips her brush in a mixture of soot and plum wine, grinning as she tests its tone. Not ideal, but definitely interesting. And somehow still Tang. It's just after sunrise when you make your way to the courtyard of the Calligraphers' Guild, where an emergency exhibition has been hastily assembled. Not to dazzle or impress, but to instruct. The sign reads, "The Elegant Art of Writing Small." Inside, a dozen senior scribes demonstrate techniques for minimizing text without losing meaning or beauty. You watch as one draws characters barely larger than sesame seeds, each stroke deliberate and gentle, like coaxing ink into silence. Smaller writing, the instructor says with a smile, means fewer scrolls, but more tea. Your hands must learn patience. Then he refills his cup for the 6th time. Apprentices practice furiously, balancing precision and legibility. One ambitious girl produces a complete inventory list in the space usually reserved for a dedication line. It's breathtaking. Also, mostly illegible. Still, everyone claps. You examine a display of historical microtexts, marveling at a Confucian commentary rendered on a patch of silk barely wider than your palm. This is the legacy, the instructor says, of scholars who ran out of room but never out of words. The day's next visit takes you to the Imperial Exam Hall, where a new challenge is unfolding. how to conduct the notoriously long civil service exams with barely enough writing material for a restaurant menu. The solution? Oral sections. Examinees now recite essays, policies, and poems aloud to panels of sleepy judges who sip tea and try not to nod off during particularly florid metaphors. Confucian values are like plum blossoms, one student begins, blooming in winter. Yes, we know, the judge interrupts, scribbling a note. Enthusiastic but predictable. Still, it's working, slowly, inefficiently, but working. You step outside into the exam courtyard, where a few failed candidates are nervously rehearsing arguments to try again next year. One is writing practice outlines on the soles of his shoes. It helps me remember, he explains. Plus, I walk on my mistakes. Further down the avenue, you encounter a most curious sight. The newly formed Scroll Census Unit. Their task is to catalog every remaining usable piece of paper across imperial departments. It's a logistical nightmare. Their cart is filled with scroll fragments, inventory slips, receipts, even ceremonial blessings no longer in use. Each is labeled with how much writing space remains. Usable, 8 characters, or only good for exclamations. One census taker shows you her favorite discovery, a scrap from a rejected marriage proposal scroll. It reads simply, "Please reconsider." I use it as a bookmark, she says. It's very persistent. Historians still argue whether this census was a feat of administrative brilliance or just a monumental exercise in imperial hoarding. Either way, it inspires a kind of paper solidarity. Departments begin voluntarily returning unused pages to the pool. A new mantra spreads. Leave no scroll behind. You wander through the artist's quarter next, where painters have turned to cloth banners as both canvas and commentary. One piece catches your eye. A sweeping brushwork of a Tang official, surrounded by dragons made entirely of paper scraps. The title? Flight of the Bureaucrat. Another artist is painting directly onto pottery. When they run out of space, they'll need mugs with memos, he says, brushing a tax summary onto the side of a teacup. Efficiency and hydration. You pass a temple garden where monks have begun teaching calligraphy using water on stone. The strokes vanish as they dry, but the lesson lingers. Not all words need to stay, one monk says. Some just want to stretch their legs and leave quietly. That afternoon, you visit the increasingly famous Red Pavilion, now the unofficial headquarters for cross-departmental paper innovation. Inside, walls are covered with pinned-up notices, suggestions, and little poems. One simply reads, "The Emperor dreams on parchment dreams. Let us not wake him with nonsense." At a central table, a gathering of scribes, merchants, and students work on a plan for rotational documentation, passing scrolls from office to office, updating and overwriting as needed. One clerk outlines the plan. Instead of 10 scrolls for 10 reports, we use 1 scroll and 10 inks. Blue for rice, red for tax, green for rainfall. She trails off. Eventually we'll run out of colors, though. Another proposes time-stamped shorthand. One symbol for as usual, another for slightly worse than last time, and a fish if it's raining. Everyone nods, surprisingly effective. That evening, as dusk falls and the lanterns flicker to life across the capital, you wander the quieter lanes of Chang'an. A breeze rattles the shutters. Somewhere, a scribe hums a folk tune while binding 3 scroll ends into one long record. The Grand Compromise, she calls it. You stop outside a tea shop where scraps of poems have been pinned to the awning. They flap gently in the wind, faint ink bleeding from one slip into another. The words blur, but the feeling remains. Inside, patrons sip quietly, sharing stories instead of writing them down. A young boy recites a tale about the emperor's pet goose. An old woman adds a line about the goose wearing court slippers. Everyone laughs. The world is still turning. The empire still speaks, even if the paper now listens less often. And as you settle down beneath a tree blooming out of season, you wonder if maybe that's all right. Maybe some things are meant to drift away like water on stone, carried not by scrolls, but by memory. You start the morning perched on the steps of the Ministry of Ceremonial Rites, where a new kind of problem is unfolding. How to conduct grand imperial ceremonies without a scroll for every tiny stage direction. The Tang dynasty is nothing if not thorough, and every bow, bell, and incense stick usually has its own set of instructions, but not today. You slip inside just as the ritual coordinator, a tall man with eyebrows like roof eaves, announces a bold change. All ceremonies will now rely on memory marshals. Their job? Whisper instructions to participants moments before they're supposed to move. You watch the marshals scurry like stagehands in embroidered robes, whispering, "Bow now. Take 3 steps. That's the incense, not your lunch," into the ears of panicked junior officials. The ceremony proceeds. Awkwardly, yes. But it does proceed. One marshal later tells you, "We're basically human scrolls now, just with worse handwriting." Across the courtyard, a group of palace attendants test out another improvisation, symbolic gesture cards. Each card bears a painted emblem, bowing, walking, kneeling, used like flashcards to guide ceremonial order. It's a bit like charades, but with incense and a lot more dignity. One card, unfortunately smudged by a teacup, causes a brief moment of chaos when a minister misinterprets "stand in reverence" as "spin in a circle." The emperor chuckles. The minister is relieved. Probably. Historians still argue whether the Tang court secretly enjoyed the informality of these leaner rituals or merely tolerated them under duress. But whispers grow. Perhaps not everything has to be documented in triplicate. After the ceremony, you walk with a servant through the Lantern District, where festival organizers are preparing for the annual Autumn Light Parade. Normally, the event would require dozens of permits, diagrams, and poetry recitations, all of which would have been beautifully scroll-bound. This year, a single wooden placard that reads, "Meet at moonrise, bring lanterns, no fireworks unless necessary." A refreshing change. You pass an old man carving poetry directly into the stalks of bamboo lantern frames. "Words must glow now," he says, grinning. No space for shadows. Nearby, a group of scholars perform what they call lantern haiku. Each haiku is scrawled on slips of bark, tied to floating paper lanterns, and released into the river. One reads, "Scrolls may vanish fast, but rivers still remember. The words we let go." You stand with a cluster of villagers as the lanterns drift out. A quiet gasp moves through the crowd as the glowing dots reflect across the water. No one writes anything down. They just watch. Later, back in the quieter quarters of the court, a senior counselor unveils what he's calling the document priority triangle. It's drawn hastily on an old festival invitation, and the ink has bled in 2 corners. But the concept is clear. At the top, imperial orders. In the middle, departmental reports. At the bottom, anything that mentions geese. Everyone laughs, but they also nod. You're invited to a workshop for court poets that evening. No paper allowed. Each poet must recite their verse aloud, while a partner sketches the scene in sand. One poem, about a moonlit fig orchard, is paired with the most beautiful sand drawing you've ever seen. Fleeting, shimmering, and instantly blown away by a passing breeze. "You had to be here," the poet says. "That's the new rule." Another performer recites a love poem so vivid that 2 spectators start writing it on their own sleeves just to remember it. The poet smiles. "See? Better than a scroll." Back at the Ministry of Commerce, a new decree has been proposed. Businesses may now use symbol menus instead of full itemized lists. You examine one from a dumpling vendor. Each flavor is represented by a tiny ink stamp. Mushroom, pork, scallion, and something labeled only as surprise. When asked, the vendor shrugs. It's based on availability and vibes. You sit down for a meal, the dumplings are delicious. And the mystery one, definitely fish. Possibly eel, maybe neither. As evening rolls in, you wander into the quiet garden behind the court, a sanctuary for tired scribes. Here, the trees are strung not with lanterns, but with reused paper slips, each bearing fragments of poems, tax records, and imperial recipes, hung like sleepy prayer flags. A young boy is reading one aloud to an elderly scribe. 2 pigs paid, 1 pig owed, add radish. They both nod solemnly. Profound, says the scribe. You sit beside a shallow pool where reeds bend gently in the night breeze. A passing attendant offers you a folded piece of silk. Inside, a tiny proverb. When ink runs dry, speak slowly. You trace it with your finger, careful not to smudge the elegant characters. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crows prematurely, perhaps confused, perhaps poetic. The stars prick the sky above the palace like pinholes in velvet. You think of all the scrolls, the ink, the careful handwriting, and how many of those records never really mattered at all. What remains, somehow, are the stories, the voices, the laughter, the accidental poetry of cabbage leaves, fish skins, and duck-themed memos. As you close your eyes, the whisper of brush on bark echoes gently in your mind. Words endure, even if their pages don't. The day begins with a murmur in the Ministry of Civil Appointments. Not the usual shuffling of forms or the scratch of brushes, but something more curious. Laughter. You slip inside and discover a newly sanctioned training session. Improvisational documentation. The lead instructor is a retired scribe, wearing a robe patched together from scraps of scroll silk. He introduces himself with a bow and an overly dramatic flourish of a brush dipped in imaginary ink. Today, he says, we learn to document without documenting. You settle into the back of the hall as he begins. His first lesson? Verbal notation drills. Pairs of scribes must recite imaginary reports to each other, memorizing keywords and echoing them back with perfect clarity, while blindfolded. One scribe blurts out, 5 goats escaped from the grain depot and were subdued using carrot diplomacy. His partner blinks, then responds solemnly, understood. Note, grain depot security may need more carrots. Everyone applauds. Somehow it's effective. The instructor continues, showing how to encode longer records into mnemonic songs. He demonstrates with a ballad about river tolls that manages to rhyme tributary with contradictory. You're impressed, also mildly confused. By mid-morning, the energy is high. You watch as clerks run impromptu debates using only chalk drawings and interpretive fan dances. It's the future of bureaucratic discourse, someone whispers, half serious. Historians still argue whether this era of performative administration marked a cultural renaissance or a bureaucratic fever dream. But in the Tang capital, it's Tuesday. You wander next to the artisan quarter, where stationers have begun stitching old correspondence into garments. You pass a tailor proudly modeling a robe, lined with the minutes of last year's tea tax meetings. Very breathable, he says, also legally binding. A merchant shows off her ledger dress, each pleat containing a transaction log, folded and fastened with decorative buttons shaped like coins. Fashion and finance, she says with a wink. Outside her shop, you spot a clothesline where pages of misprinted proclamations are drying, washed clean and ready to be used again. They flutter in the breeze like surrender flags made of past mistakes. Later, you return to the Red Pavilion, where a new project is underway. The Tang Sound Archive. No paper, just people. Each volunteer is responsible for memorizing and reciting an assigned document, once per day, aloud, in the courtyard. for passers-by to absorb like morning announcements from a gentle foghorn. You sit with a man who has committed to memory all local weather reports since last autumn. Today, he intones, marks the 132nd consecutive mild breeze from the northwest, 4 gentle rains, 1 frost, 2 dogs were mildly startled. End report. You applaud, he bows. Across the pavilion, a younger woman is practicing imperial court correspondence by whispering them into clay pots. The pots are then sealed, labeled, and stored in a shelf called the Echo Archive. Someone asks, "Will we ever open them?" She shrugs. Maybe. Maybe we'll just remember they're there. In the residential districts, families have taken to writing short instructions and reminders on doorposts in chalk. It's the age of one-day declarations. You pass a house that reads, "Boil rice before noon. Don't trust the neighbor's goose." Another reads, "Borrowed auntie's ink block. Return before sunset or face judgment." It's unclear what judgment means, but the handwriting is very stern. Meanwhile, back at the palace, the emperor is said to have adopted a new method of private communication. Scroll origami. He folds messages into elaborate cranes, fans, and rabbits, which are delivered silently by attendants. You watch one such rabbit delivered to a startled advisor, who unfolds it to read, "Reduce peach wine shipments. Increase silence." A concise monarch, your emperor. The military has begun experimenting too. You're taken to a training ground where officers demonstrate a battlefield report composed entirely of hand signals, foot stomps, and choreographed coughs. It's part semaphore, part interpretive martial arts. One soldier coughs twice, makes a circle with his hands, and draws a symbol in the dirt that might be enemy or might be breakfast. No one is sure. A second soldier nods and draws an arrow toward the east. Everyone agrees this means go east. Or possibly, the eggs are ready. You decide not to question it further. At the archives, scholars have turned to scent codices. You peer into a quiet laboratory where herbs and spices are crushed and infused into cloth to encode meaning. Lavender for diplomacy, mint for taxes, clove for minor border disputes. One researcher waves a tiny pouch beneath your nose and says, "This is the entire harvest report from Luoyang." You sneeze and mutter, "Very fragrant." He beams. Historians still argue whether scent-based records were ever more than an elaborate prank by the palace perfumers. But some of the surviving samples do correspond closely with actual records, suggesting that at least someone took it seriously. As night falls again, you attend a shadow play staged in the outer courtyard of the Poetry Hall. The performers act out major announcements, new laws, tax adjustments, road repairs, using puppets shaped like ministers and metaphorical animals. Tonight's theme: the Ministry of Transport tries to build a bridge without a map. The goat puppet falls off a cliff. The owl advises against it. The emperor sighs deeply. Everyone applauds. You lie back on a worn bench as the shadows flicker above you. The night breeze carries the smell of ink, rice glue, and star jasmine. Above, the sky is cloudless. Someone, somewhere, is muttering a list of grain quotas into a woven basket, hoping the words will hold. Somewhere else, a robe made of old treaties flutters softly as its wearer walks down a lantern-lit alley. You exhale, you listen, the city speaks, and in that gentle hush, the absence of scrolls doesn't feel like silence. It feels like something new, something softer. The sun rises on a city of murmurs. You begin your day in the palace tea hall, where the chatter is unusually hushed. Not from fear or ceremony, but because scribes have started using teacups as message boards. You sit at a lacquered table beside a pot of chrysanthemum tea. The server hands you a cup with elegant calligraphy swirling inside the rim. Rice storage to be re-evaluated. Also, avoid the West Garden. It's muddy. This is the new memo system. Teacup dispatches. Each message must be short enough to curve along the interior, and polite enough not to ruin someone's drink. You sip gently. The ink doesn't bleed. An impressive technique. Made with burned peach pits, the server whispers. Smoky, but waterproof. At the next table, a debate brews, no pun intended, over whether flavor-enhancing ink will confuse the message. One official says yes, another shrugs. A third says, "Depends on the flavor. I once read a promotion request that tasted like regret." Back at the Ministry of Agriculture, new innovations are bubbling up. Literally. A team of inventors is testing scrolls printed on dried tofu skin. It's light, writable, and technically edible. You watch as one scribe writes a tax notice, folds it, and dips it in soy sauce to seal the deal. Then he takes a bite. "Useful and delicious," he says. "Also, a little chewy." Next to him, another worker is experimenting with dried lily pads. "Slippery," she mutters, "but elegant." A prototype farming schedule floats gently in a basin of water, readable from above like a lotus of bureaucracy. You wander into a nearby barn where farmers have begun tattooing grain quotas onto their oxen's hides using non-toxic ink. "He forgets nothing," one farmer says, patting the broad shoulder of an ox named Minister Wu. "Also won't let you write over old entries." Historians still argue whether this was a case of practical record-keeping or just farmer humor taken too far. Either way, Minister Wu becomes somewhat of a local celebrity. Further south in the textile quarter, dyers are soaking strips of old silk letters in indigo vats to produce a new fabric color. Scholar's blue. The uneven tones, they say, come from the ink soaking into the dye. Each robe a wearable ghost of lost correspondence. One robe bears faint traces of a rejected imperial poem. You lean in to read a line still barely visible across the sleeve. Even dragons forget sometimes. A tailor tells you people now request robes by topic. This one's all-weather reports. That one's merchant gossip. And this beauty here? Pure bureaucratic infighting. Notice the aggressive pleats. You chuckle, then follow a soft chanting sound to a temple hall where monks are participating in the latest archival shift. Choral memorization. A dozen voices recite portions of land records, grain tallies, and water usage estimates in a slow, musical cadence. Each monk holds a different report in their head. Together, they form the Tang's first fully vocal archive. You ask one monk what happens if someone forgets. "We nudge gently with percussion," he says, tapping a small gong. The emperor's astrologers, not to be left behind, are developing a star-based index system. You sit with one who gestures to a night map marked with glowing stones. We place events beside constellations. Flood near the river dragon. Tax rise under the white ox. You ask what happens if a second flood occurs. "Then it becomes the lesser flood," he replies, "and the first becomes the greater flood. Unless the second is worse, in which case they switch titles. Or they form a dynasty of flood events." He pauses. Admittedly, it's a work in progress. Outside the observatory, you run into a painter tasked with summarizing daily events in a single image. She calls it "one brush a day." Today's picture? A fish biting a scroll while a goose watches. Interpretive, she explains, but based on a real incident. You nod solemnly. Of course it is. In the markets, a new form of oral storytelling is gaining ground. The Bulletin Bard. You follow one as he strolls from street to street, announcing the day's news in rhyme and rhythm. His current performance includes grain prices, temple renovations, and a gentle reminder that the West Alley is temporarily closed due to noodle flooding. Tragic, he sings, but delicious. People tip him with bits of ribbon and stray syllables. One woman tosses him a scrap of fabric that reads, "Please say hello to my cousin in Hangzhou." He nods and tucks it into his sash. As dusk rolls in, you join a quiet circle in the grand courtyard, where courtiers now gather for evening edits. a tradition where individuals speak aloud anything they would have written down that day. Some confess, some complain, some recite full procurement lists with surprising poetic cadence. One says, 3 jars of pickled radish, 2 lengths of rope, and an apology to the carpenter. Another adds, received a goose, did not ask for it. The wind picks up gently, and the words drift like leaves. No one records them. They're not meant to be kept. They're meant to be heard. And maybe that's enough. You lie back on the cool stone and look up at the deepening sky. Somewhere far away, a clerk is folding an old scroll into a kite. A child is writing on bark. A monk is singing a weather report. And somehow the Tang still spins forward. The air is thick with morning mist as you step into the palace gardens, which have now doubled as a kind of living archive. Gardeners, desperate for ways to communicate crop needs without consuming paper, have devised an entirely new language of twine and blossom placement. A single peach blossom laid across a cabbage leaf means water sparingly. A bundled cluster of garlic scapes tied with yellow thread means planted too early, try again next month. You squint at a particularly complex arrangement involving radish tops, 2 pine cones, and a single plum pit. The gardener shrugs. I was feeling philosophical. You trail your hand along a trellis where vines are being gently trained into the shape of characters. One says, wait. Another says, patience. A third says, beans. All equally useful. Not far from the garden gate, a group of culinary scribes, yes, that's apparently a real title, are demonstrating how recipes are now conveyed via flavored oils and spice blends. One apprentice lets you taste a vinegar-soaked ginger slice and explains, that means add 2 spoons of salt. If it burns your tongue slightly, you've used too much. You raise an eyebrow. A senior cook hands you a dumpling and says, this one contains a request to borrow a wok. You take a bite. It's peppery, a little sweet, and very insistent. Historians still argue whether this edible code system was practical or just a side effect of chronic hunger among kitchen staff. But there are rumors that an entire imperial menu once served as the transcript of a trade negotiation. The dessert reportedly implied an insult. War was nearly declared over a tart. In the music hall, instruments have taken on new functions. Zithers and flutes now hum with encoded rhythms, representing historical dates and bureaucratic updates. You sit beside a guzheng player who taps a slow pattern across the strings. 2 carts of millet delayed, she murmurs. Governor of Shu apologizes. Requests more goats. You hum in agreement, seems fair. Elsewhere in the palace, the archivists have gone underground, literally. The imperial tunnels, once used to ferry messages discreetly between departments, have been repurposed into what's being called the Subterranean Memo Theater. Here, costumed performers reenact documents no longer available on paper. Today's reenactment? A tax dispute involving 3 rice merchants, a stolen sedan chair, and a misinterpreted proverb about pigs. The audience laughs, gasps, and takes mental notes. One elderly spectator leans over to you and whispers, "That's my cousin up there playing the barrel inspector. He's never read a single scroll in his life." Outside the tunnel exit, school teachers are preparing for a lesson using the chalk circle method. In an open courtyard, students gather around large circles drawn in ash and charcoal. Their assignments? Speak their responses aloud while drawing supporting diagrams with sticks. A boy explains land distribution using 2 rocks and a line of ants. His friend describes a trade route by tracing it in dust with her toe. You watch quietly, thinking how remarkably adaptable children are, less concerned with materials, more excited by the challenge of being heard. You visit a potter's stall later in the day, where ceramicists are now embedding historical notes into the glazes of their bowls. Hold one in the sunlight just right, and a faint pattern reveals itself. River flood logs, celestial omens, and someone's very detailed noodle order from 6 months ago. Functional tableware and archive, the potter beams. Just don't scrub too hard. Down by the riverbanks, boatmen have joined in too. With paper short, they now knot ropes in specific patterns to signal their cargo, intended routes, and docking preferences. A triple loop followed by a loose braid means carrying salt, headed south, please prepare cabbage. Historians still argue whether this knot code was developed independently or borrowed from older fishing communities, but its complexity grows daily. You watch one sailor tie a complicated message and call it poetic logistics. His apprentice nods gravely. I cried once while learning it. That evening, you find yourself near the lantern courtyard again, where a group of monks light incense and recite poems that were never written, only passed from memory to memory. Each verse fades into the smoke, curling upward like a forgotten letter to the moon. You sit with a scribe who hasn't touched a brush in weeks. She offers you a carved jade pendant with tiny, raised characters along the side. It's my father's birth record, she says softly. I'll pass it to my son someday. Until then, I read it every new moon. As night deepens, the city is quiet. You drift through narrow streets where stories are whispered instead of written. Jokes are carved into melon rinds, and public notices are sung at the hour of stew. You pass a courtyard where someone's chalked a message on the stone floor. Too late for scrolls, tell me your truth. You pause, you listen, and the city, for all its scarcity, feels somehow more full. At first light, you find yourself walking along the edge of the South District, where a new experiment is quietly gaining popularity. The living ledger trees. They're mulberries, mostly, broad-leaved and patient, chosen for their connection to paper and their agreeable attitude toward being written on. You watch a clerk approach a young tree with a small brush and a bowl of vegetable dye. She gently paints today's transaction log across the leaves, 1 line per frond. This one's for rice owed. That's for thread delivered. And that little one near the bottom? A reminder to check on Aunt Fen's goat. By nightfall, the wind will scatter the record. But in the moment, it exists. Whispering, flickering, gently swaying like an account book having a particularly poetic day. You walk further and notice something new. Trees bearing mismatched records. One leaf lists carpentry supplies. Another has a riddle. People are mixing departments, someone explains, laughing. The forestry office keeps writing poems about hammers. The blacksmith guild is trying haiku. You nod, it tracks. Historians still argue whether the living ledger trees were a practical solution or just a beautiful green spiral into chaos. Either way, they became beloved. You pass one young boy seated beneath a low branch, softly reciting the trades of the week like lullabies. Back at the palace's Hall of Mirrors, courtiers have taken to solving another problem: how to preserve important edicts without actual records. Their answer: mirrored reversals. You're led into a chamber where edicts are carved backwards onto polished metal slabs. A single flame reveals the writing in reflection. Shimmering, brief, and haunting. It's not meant to last, one steward whispers. It's meant to remind. You tilt your head, trying to read a message. Let the grain flow like water, not like pride. Below it, a series of backwards numbers. Maybe dates, maybe metaphors. Later, on the steps of the Imperial Library, now eerily quiet, you encounter the Whisper Keepers, volunteers who memorize and repeat classic texts aloud each day. They're assigned sections of poetry, medical treatises, and even tax regulations, all recited softly in overlapping layers. You pause and listen. It's like rain made of memory. One man chants the duties of regional governors, while a child nearby sings a farming almanac to the tune of a lullaby. You catch snippets. Avoid planting near the shadow of pride. Rain expected on the 3rd rooster. You nod, as if this makes complete sense. It probably does. Not far from there, the Tang court's painters have begun a new method of conveying information. Visual metaphors. Instead of writing reports, they now paint symbolic scenes. A grain surplus? A bowl overflowing beside a sleeping rooster. A merchant delay? A turtle hiding behind a coin. One particularly evocative scroll shows a fish riding a dragon into the sky, followed by a sheep holding a lantern. You raise an eyebrow. "Oh," the artist says, "that means we need more clay jars in the northeast provinces." "Of course," you reply. Historians still argue whether these images conveyed actual information or were simply the artist's revenge for years of budget cuts. Either way, the emperor is said to love them. One minister claims he approved 3 policies based on a painting of ducks. Meanwhile, the less artistic corners of the empire are finding their own solutions. In the coin-casting district, workers have started stamping daily notices directly onto metal currency. One side bears the usual seal. The other has miniature characters informing the bearer of road closures, upcoming feasts, or bureaucratic scandals. You're handed a coin that reads, "Beware cabbage shipments from the west. Mild spoilage suspected." Another simply says, "The goose returns." You don't ask. At a nearby port, traders have begun exchanging bundles of scented herbs to indicate current market values. Cinnamon means prices are steady. Sage means buy now. Mugwort, apparently, means brace yourself. You watch a sailor trade a sprig of basil for a barrel of pickled radish. "A strong deal," he says. It smelled of confidence. Later, you stroll past a scribe's school where apprentices practice their brush strokes in sand-filled trays. One boy carefully inscribes a Confucian phrase, only to have a stray breeze erase it moments later. He sighs. Starts again. Smiles. "You don't get attached," the teacher says. "You just get better." You lean into a column and watch as dozens of tiny brushes sweep across the sand, rising and falling like waves. Lessons that drift and vanish. Still taught. Still learned. In the evening, you visit the opera house, which has transformed into a civic bulletin center. Each performance now includes a satirical retelling of current events, disguised, of course, as historical allegory. Tonight's theme? The farmer who mistook his goose for a scroll. It's absurd. It's brilliant. The goose gets promoted to governor. The audience applauds thunderously. As the final act ends, and the performers take their bows, you exit into the courtyard where a lantern flickers beneath a poem carved into wet clay. No scrolls to hold us, but we hold each other's words, gently like silence. You stand beneath it a while, hands warm from tea and laughter. A young girl passes you and asks, "What's the headline today?" You think a moment, then smile. "Less paper, more poetry?" She nods. "Sounds right." You wake to the sound of bells. Not loud, ceremonial ones, but soft, melodic tones ringing from above a street vendor's stall. As you approach, you realize each bell is inscribed with a different message, and the pitch of the ring corresponds to its content. A high chime means fresh fish today. A deeper toll indicates short on noodles. A trembling musical trill seems to mean prices negotiable, especially if you flatter my hat. You try it. The vendor nods approvingly. The hat is, admittedly, magnificent. This is the latest development in Tang urban communication. Bell code. One vendor tells you they're faster than scrolls and much harder to misplace in a stew. You sip your morning tea as the city's symphony plays around you. News, gossip, warnings, and wishes, all gently drifting in and out of tune. At the Ministry of Public Works, a new experiment is underway. Stone stamps. You watch a team of artisans carve common announcements into brick-sized tablets. These are then dipped in paint and pressed onto silk banners, banners that can be hung, reused, or in an emergency, folded into surprisingly sturdy hats. One such stamp reads, "Bridge repairs complete. Proceed with dignified enthusiasm." A senior official beams. "We call it durable decree distribution." You wander further into the city, to a small village tucked just outside the eastern gate, where a group of elders has revived a long-abandoned tradition. Foot messages. These are literal footprints, left intentionally with dyed soles on pale clay streets, spelling out short sentences. Fish at market. Avoid north well. The cat has returned. It's like reading a secret, dusty newspaper written by polite ghosts. You try it yourself, leaving a careful set of characters near the bakery. "Excellent buns today. Don't be shy." A child laughs and points at your feet. You misspelled excellent. You bow solemnly. It was a creative choice. Back inside the capital, the silk artists have gone full multimedia. You enter a workshop where tailors are stitching miniature tapestries into the linings of garments, each depicting a day's worth of events in a single visual thread. One robe shows a peach tree shaking its fruit into an open ledger. Another features a goat sailing past the moon. You ask, hesitantly, "Is this weather-related?" "Border inspection," the tailor replies. "It's metaphorical." Historians still argue whether these narrative garments carried any real utility or were simply gorgeous distractions from chaos. Either way, fashion in the Tang court has never been more interpretive. At the Emperor's Pavilion, the inner court is hosting a contest. Best Alternative Archiving Method. You arrive just in time to see a monk demonstrating a coded abacus, where specific arrangements of beads tell entire stories. "This one," he says, sliding 3 beads and tapping twice, tells of a baker who accidentally created a new holiday by oversalting imperial biscuits. You blink. "And this?" He slides 4 beads diagonally. A quiet scandal involving a fake phoenix sighting and 3 wigs. Applause. Next up is a potter, showing a set of nesting bowls. Each layer represents a deeper level of bureaucratic truth. The outer bowl says, "No issue." The next reads, "Minor complication." The innermost bowl, painted in urgent crimson, says, "We lost the horses." You look at the Emperor. He is delighted. The winner, however, is a gardener who demonstrates a wind chime that hums a tune corresponding to daily rations. "Low notes mean more barley," she says. "High notes mean we're mostly eating pickles." The court claps politely. You're not sure whether in admiration or mild culinary despair. As night falls, you're invited to a moon viewing party hosted by the Ministry of Culture. But instead of reciting poetry, guests must describe events using only shadows. You watch as a shadow play unfolds on a rice paper screen. It shows a small bird gathering seeds, a wind that blows them away, and a larger bird offering shelter beneath its wing. "Ah," says a scholar beside you. A clear commentary on last month's failed tax initiative. You nod. Very moving. Nearby, a scholar demonstrates another innovation. Fan-folded folk tales. She flips open a paper fan to reveal a delicately painted story told across each rib. It's about a scholar who tries to write a poem with no ink and finds inspiration in falling leaves, she says, twirling it closed. A metaphor, of course. And very cooling, you reply, enjoying the breeze. Down a quiet alley near the stables, you stumble upon something strange. An entire wall coated in handprints. Each one is slightly different. Some have thumb marks high, some low, a few smudged. "It's a census," explains a local official. "Name, age, and favorite dumpling filling encoded in the spacing." You squint. "This one prefers mushroom and ginger?" "Exactly." Children nearby play a game involving catching scrolls by tracing characters in the air and guessing the message. It's half charades, half fortune-telling. One girl mimes a noodle twirl and a goat leap. Her friends shout, "Rice tax is due." "Correct!" she beams. The palace guards now use sand trays for shift logs. Before leaving their post, They smooth the tray and write one word with their fingertip. Clear. Quiet. Moonlit. The next guard reads it, nods, wipes the word, and adds their own. It's communication as soft as breath. By midnight, you're back near the lantern courtyard, where someone has painted a message onto the shell of a turtle. There is no scroll, but there is still the story. The turtle blinks, walks away, slowly. No rush. The message will arrive when it arrives. You lie down beside the reflecting pool, watching the sky mirrored in water. No scrolls rustle, no ink smudges, but the air is full of memory. And you, floating in it, feel every word. Dawn arrives with the gentle hiss of steam kettles in the far kitchen courts, where breakfast comes with side servings of speculation. You follow the scent of fried rice and sesame oil toward a lively experiment being run by the imperial chefs, edible correspondence. They've taken the phrase message delivery a step further. On each tray is a carefully arranged meal, where ingredients are positioned to convey news. A slice of melon beside pickled radish means harvest good, expect trade. A fish atop a lotus leaf means governor requests a raise. The flavor of the sauce determines urgency. Today's rice bowl has a drizzle of sour plum sauce on one side and a slice of duck neck pointing east. You chew thoughtfully and decide it probably means something bureaucratic happened in Luoyang, possibly involving ducks. Probably nothing urgent. Historians still argue whether this edible messaging system ever became formalized or if it remained a delicious novelty of palace gossip. Either way, you have no complaints, particularly about the dumplings that spell "all is calm" in Scallion. You step outside to the garden colonnade, where another quiet revolution is happening. People are using birds, not just to carry messages, but to be the message. A young courier ties colorful silk threads to a sparrow's leg, the combination of thread length and color forming a code. Red for military news, blue for trade updates, green for personal requests. The bird flits away like a feathered footnote. In the marketplace, cage tenders now train myna birds to repeat local news in rhythmic chants. One particularly talkative bird croons, "River market flooded, bananas half price, avoid the goat." The voice is eerily formal, like a miniature bureaucrat in feathers. You listen for a moment, then glance around just to be sure. There is, in fact, a goat watching you. Intently, you walk briskly in the other direction. At the Scholars' Terrace, students now practice their calligraphy in water on hot stone. The characters shimmer for just a moment before evaporating in the sun, leaving no record except the motion of the hand and the satisfaction of form. You kneel beside one student who's just completed a full Confucian verse. "Why do it if it disappears?" you ask. She shrugs. "The mountain doesn't remember every breeze, but it's shaped by them." You pretend you weren't about to cry. Nearby, an aging philosopher has taken to summarizing entire government memos using gestures, grunts, and elaborate eyebrow movements. A crowd watches raptly as he portrays a tax appeal using only 2 sneezes, a sigh, and what looks like a slow-motion fish impersonation. A court official nods. That's almost word for word. As the day heats up, you retreat into a shaded courtyard filled with silk lanterns. At first glance, they seem decorative, but each one is part of a growing trend. The Lantern Registry. People write their daily notes, hopes, or grievances in faint ink around the lantern's rim. When lit at night, the heat causes the ink to fade, burning the words into memory, not parchment. You lean in to read one. "I have 10 coins, a sick chicken, and hope. I'd like to trade." Another. "If anyone sees a black cat with a white paw, tell it I forgive it." You smile, touched. Somewhere in this city, a very guilty-looking cat is probably sighing with relief. At the Ministry of Rites, record-keeping has taken a spiritual turn. Priests now weave incense sticks with secret messages embedded in the blend. Certain combinations of herbs signal imperial approval, discontent, or urgent need for calm. You're offered one to light. It smells of cinnamon and quiet shame. That's for when you forgot a meeting, the priest says gently. As the smoke curls upward, you find yourself back at the Red Pavilion, where elders gather to compose wind letters. Short phrases whispered into bamboo tubes, sealed, and released into the breeze from the high balconies. Do they go anywhere? You ask. An old man grins. Of course. They go forward. You lean over and whisper into a tube of your own. The paper's gone, but the words still matter. It drifts away on the wind, bobbing like a lazy bee toward rooftops and bell towers and whatever waits beyond. In the narrow alleys, children are creating a new kind of graffiti. No ink, no carving, just smudges of flour on brick walls, forming temporary characters. You see a line of 5 marks in a row. It means Grandma's cooking again, a boy explains. You find another message beside a bakery door. Bread for thoughts. Underneath, someone has pressed a coin into the dough and let it harden like a seal. Further down, the herbalists have begun braiding messages into the stems of dried plants. A sprig of mint bent sharply at the base means, "Come quickly." Chamomile braided with lemongrass signals, "All is well." You lift one tied with rosemary and a single jade bead. "Warning," someone whispers. You gently put it back. As evening falls, the shadow puppeteers prepare their stage again. But tonight, they perform The Tale of the Vanishing Records, a dramatic retelling of the paper shortage. There's a villain made of spilled ink, a hero with a bamboo flute, and a scroll that turns into a dragon. The audience watches breathless, you too! And when the scroll dragon vanishes in a puff of incense, the silence that follows is warm, not empty. You look around at this city of painted leaves, scented messages, edible memos, and whispered codes. No scrolls needed. The Tang still remembers, and so do you. You begin your morning seated cross-legged beside a washerwoman who is rhythmically slapping garments against a flat stone while murmuring dates and figures under her breath. At first, it seems like idle habit, but you soon notice a pattern. The slap of the cloth, the pause, the muttered number. It's a laundry ledger. She explains that with no paper to log palace linens or courtier robes, she's memorized who owns what and when it was last cleaned, entirely through motion and murmurs. This spot here, she says, pointing to a small stain, belongs to the Minister of Ritual's cousin. Fish sauce incident. He denies it. Hythe, you nod, impressed. There are rumors she once confronted a noble over unpaid laundering by slapping his tunic rhythmically until he admitted guilt. Historians still argue whether this was justice or just exceptionally coordinated passive aggression. Across the courtyard, cobblers are writing invoices on the soles of shoes using tiny, inverted characters. You lift a sandal and squint. There it is. A line of elegant script carved so delicately it could almost pass for decoration. The shoemaker explains it's a form of documentation that wears away naturally. By the time payment is due, so is a new pair. You chuckle. Poetic capitalism. Elsewhere in the capital, rumor walls have become official. What started as idle chalk scrawls behind tea shops has evolved into a regulated public space where citizens post whispered truths, speculations, and the occasional passive-aggressive compliment. One wall reads, "Zhang from the grain office sings to his pickles. We approve." Another, "If you see the astrologer's apprentice, tell him he dropped his metaphor." The emperor's advisors pretend not to read them, but everyone knows the truth. One even scrawled a rebuttal in perfect couplet form. "The goose was never late. The goose was contemplating distance." You're not sure what that means, but it sounds profound. Back in the foreign quarter, traders have developed yet another workaround. Knot painting. It's part visual art, part textile, part ciphers. Colored strings are dipped in dyes, knotted to indicate values, then pressed onto cloth to leave impressions. The result resembles a kind of polychrome fingerprint of trade. One merchant shows you his latest shipment invoice painted in overlapping coils of indigo and saffron. I sold 16 bolts of silk, bought 7 goats, and lost 1 sandal. All there. You admire it. Quite expressive. He nods. It's abstract expressionist bookkeeping. You wander over to the bamboo grove behind the western shrine, where monks are cultivating plants with growing patterns shaped by wind and training into literal phrases. By tying certain shoots and guiding their curves, the plants eventually grow into recognizable characters, though they take weeks or even months to fully form. One bamboo reads, "Still waiting for approval." Another, more twisted and hesitant, "This was not my idea." The monks nod solemnly when you ask if they're legible. To the patient, one says, "Near the city's waterworks, engineers have introduced a new flood alert system involving floating gourds. Each gourd is carved with symbols and released upstream. If it arrives early, it signals rising water. If it arrives late or bloated, it means something else entirely. One gourd today arrives with chew marks and an apology. You raise an eyebrow. Otter interference, the engineer explains. Historians still argue whether this system was more reliable than earlier flood records. One thing's certain, it's much cuter. In the theater district, performers are reviving ancient dance forms, but each movement now conveys specific bureaucratic phrases. A bowed turn means permit granted. A high leap followed by a pause means request pending. An awkward crab walk across the stage? We regret to inform you. You sit through a particularly impressive performance, where an entire tax audit is conveyed through interpretive ribbon twirling and one dramatic sneeze. The audience applauds politely. You see one magistrate quietly take notes with his feet. In the sloping alleys behind the herbalist quarter, beggars have become poets, recording transactions by carving single lines into hollow gourds. You read one. "He gave me rice, I gave him a story." Another. "Too proud to ask, too hungry not to." They string the gourds above their shelters, letting the wind knock them softly against each other. "Our symphony," a man says, "of need and giving and memory." You linger longer than you meant to. That night, the Moongate Garden is lit with hundreds of water bowls. Each one reflects starlight in a different way, based on what's written or etched at the bottom. You lean over and read, "If I forget, remind me with tea." Another says, "All debts forgiven, except the one you owe yourself." One simply reads, "Still here." You lie beside the pool and listen to the silence between the bowls. Even now, with no scrolls, no ink, no stamps or seals, the city remembers. The scribes walk barefoot now, leaving meaning in their steps. The cooks write in spice. The actors speak in shoulder rolls. And the wind, always listening, carries their words across the rooftops and into tomorrow. You close your eyes. A shadow passes over you. Maybe a bird, maybe a message. And somewhere nearby, someone finishes telling a story to a goat. In the palace stables, you wake to the rhythm of hooves echoing through a long, arched corridor. An oddly graceful sound, like punctuation tapping out a thought. The grooms have started using the horses' gait patterns as a messaging system. Depending on the pace, direction, and order of horses sent, officials can interpret entire memos without a single written word. A fast canter followed by 2 gentle trots and a pause. The western grain shipment is late, but not alarmingly so. A circular trot followed by a sudden stop. Someone lost the seal again. Historians still argue whether this equine semaphore ever reached true accuracy, or was just a highly stylized excuse to trot around dramatically. Either way, it's hard to deny the majestic flair. You catch yourself reading too much into a prancing pony, wondering if it's secretly gossiping about the palace astrologer. You cross the threshold into the musicians' hall, where scholars are now encoding poetry and correspondence into lute tablature. Entire stanzas ride between chords, melodies becoming repositories of knowledge, letters sung into silk string resonance. One musician strums gently, her fingers pausing on a phrase that, she explains, means good rice this season, though the governor is sulking again. The next note is slightly flat. That's on purpose, she says, to indicate passive aggression. She finishes the song with a flourish and a satisfied sigh. Now it's archived, she whispers, as if laying a memory to rest. Outside, a group of apprentices rehearses the same message, slightly out of tune, but determined. You admire their effort. Their version has an unintentional hiccup that suggests the governor might also be mildly allergic to fish. You move on. In the dyeing quarter, you're led into a room filled with hundreds of strips of silk, each a different shade, each representing a specific decree. The color archive, they call it. Red for new policies, gold for royal observations, blue for interdepartmental apologies. The deeper the hue, the greater the urgency. You run your hand along one especially dark swatch of indigo. Famine warning, the attendant says. But old. The response already came. Olive green. You nod, somewhat relieved. You'd always suspected olive green was a hopeful color. People carry samples on their person now. Tiny flags tucked into belts or hairpins, fluttering like secret signals. One guard flashes you a strip of violet and grins. It means I know a shortcut to the kitchens. Interested? Of course you are. In the kitchens themselves, messages are exchanged in the patterns of dumpling folds. A pinched triangle? Sweet filling? Happy news? A scalloped crescent? A request is coming. A poorly made dumpling with a lopsided edge? Someone's in trouble, possibly me. You eat that one. It's salty and a little guilty tasting. Needs more ginger, you say. One chef winks. That's a metaphor. Later, you find yourself in a tiny observatory where court astronomers are projecting coded star maps onto ceiling tiles. By adjusting the constellations in just so positions, they manage to frame messages between the stars. Political shifts, bureaucratic updates, the occasional request for more wine. You tilt your head as one constellation shifts slightly. That says, delay the census, the astronomer notes. Or it might say, too many turtles. We're still refining the punctuation. Historians still argue whether these celestial documents were effective or just wishful thinking inscribed on night. But even so, they remain. Quiet, glimmering, impossible to forge. In the perfume quarter, perfumers have perfected what might be the most ephemeral form of record-keeping yet, scented messages. One vial might carry a memory of baked pears and charcoal smoke, which translates loosely to winter provisions arrived, some spoilage. Another vial, sharp, floral, with a hint of vinegar, means court intrigue involving 4 robes and a falsified omen. You sniff carefully. What's this one? The perfumer takes the vial reverently. It's the scent of good news, she whispers. But from last year, you breathe it in anyway, it still lingers. Later in the royal bathhouse, the attendants use steam to write messages on the tile walls, revealing words hidden in mineral salt patterns. One wall declares, long meeting, send snacks. Another says, the left faucet squeaks, possibly haunted. You sit in the mist and listen as someone recounts a tax debate using only bubbles. The attendants nod solemnly. Apparently, this makes sense. You towel off and follow the marble corridor toward the scribe's rest, where former clerks now meet to reminisce. Not in ink, but in sighs. Each sigh means something. A long inhale and slow exhale. Remember that time the Treasury double-reported tribute from Silla? A short huff with a rising whistle. The imperial dog ate an edict again. They trade memories like cards, but softer, and often sleepier. One sigh is so wistful, it draws a small crowd. That, someone whispers. was the year the dragon lanterns blew away mid-ceremony, and we all pretended it was part of the plan. You smile. History, it turns out, is just memory wrapped in clever delivery. At the edge of the city, near the ferry docks, boatmen still carve quick notes into dried fish skin. It's surprisingly durable, and surprisingly legible if you don't mind a little flakiness. You hold one in your hands. It reads, "All is quiet, storm past, tell Auntie I miss her." You hand it back carefully, and the boatman nods. It'll get where it's going. Even now, in the candle-lit hours of a once-papered empire, the Tang find ways to hold on. Through scent, motion, light, and song, they write themselves into each day. And you, lucky visitor, drift alongside it, inkless, scrollless, yet surrounded by story. You're woken gently, not by sound or light, but by the flicker of movement on the wall. Silhouettes dance across the plaster in rhythmic sequences, cast by lanterns fitted with rotating slats. This, you discover, is part of the new visual messaging trend. Shadow reels. Craftsmen have begun carving messages into delicate wooden wheels, so that when light shines through them, words and images scroll across walls like ancient projections. One reel plays the daily rice tally. Another, far more ambitious, tells the entire saga of a minister's resignation through the imagery of a snail sliding off a lotus leaf. You sit back and watch as a sheep spins in slow circles, pursued by a tax official made entirely of triangles. Historians still argue whether anyone ever understood these reels of light, but you find them oddly compelling. Also, you now feel slightly suspicious of sheep. Just down the avenue, carpenters have devised a less theatrical but equally creative approach: knot code beams. Each wooden beam used in palace repairs now contains notches, grooves, and tiny carved patterns that signify dates, names, and functions. An entire hallway becomes a rolling scroll, hidden in plain view. One palace guard pats the wall affectionately. "This beam says I approved 3 new windows and got scolded for smiling too much." You run your hand along another. Its grooves read, "Paint me next season, or I'll complain." You believe it. In the bustling weaver's hall, tailors now tell news in pattern and stitch. The zigzag hem of a robe signals court promotions. Embroidered clouds on a sash suggest delays in agricultural shipments. The more layered the embroidery, the more dramatic the message. You admire a particularly flamboyant vest covered in waves, ducks, and oddly triumphant lemons. The tailor grins. "It means the emperor's boat capsized, but everyone laughed, so it doesn't count." Fashion and forgiveness, woven literally into the cloth. As you cross through the gardens, you stumble upon a gathering of readers without books. They're participating in what has become known as echo reading, where people recite texts they've heard earlier that week, relying on memory, rhythm, and group correction. One person chants, "The barley is short, but the wine is willing." Another adds, "Beware the 9th cart, its wheels lie." Together, the group rebuilds an entire market report from shared recollection and dramatic flair. Someone chimes in with a song verse that may or may not be about beets. Everyone agrees it belongs. Historians still argue whether this style of group recitation preserved truth or polished it into legend. Either way, you feel warmed by the cadence of remembered things. Further along, the blacksmiths are documenting orders by heat-tempering patterns onto iron. The shifting colors from red to blue tell a code. Length of time in the fire, number of taps, and final cooling process all indicate who ordered what. You squint at a blade laid across an anvil. 2 wheels ordered, 1 shoe resoled, 1 apology accepted, says the smith with a shrug. We record our business like we forge, layer by layer until it shines. Behind the stables, children draw maps in dust and read them aloud like prophecies. They assign meaning to twig placement and pebble patterns. This trail says, Aunt June burned the rice. These stones say the goats have unionized. You listen patiently as one particularly serious child declares that the dried leaf near the north line indicates a new moon dinner dispute. Another child gasps. So that's why Grandma glared at Uncle Bing. It's nonsense, probably, but you take notes just in case. In the courtyard near the palace kitchens, soup messages are the current fashion. Yes, literal soup. Floating ingredients signal particular updates. A slice of ginger at 12 o'clock means travel news. A lotus seed drifting east suggests a marriage proposal is pending. Today's broth has 6 peas floating in a perfect line, a lone mushroom turning in circles, and a single strand of noodle shaped like the number 9. You look up. The cook whispers. It means the tax office is circling a minor error but pretending they didn't see it. You nod. It's very savory. At the foot of the bell tower, a small group gathers around a giant stone slab with tiny holes drilled into it. As wind passes through the openings, it produces soft, flute-like notes in a set sequence. Each tune corresponds to a verse, a policy, or a bit of philosophical musing. Today, the wind sings, "Balance the books, balance the moon." It's haunting. You stay until the wind changes direction and the song fades. By the edge of the city moat, you watch people releasing paper boats with petals and tiny charms inside. These are floating drafts, short, symbolic letters to ancestors or the future, each one bobbing gently away with the current. You read one aloud before it disappears. If we forget the stories, remind us with silence. You do not know who it was for, but somehow, it feels like it was for everyone. As you cross the final bridge of the day, the sun lowering behind a haze of gold, a passing clerk bumps your elbow and drops a clay coin etched with 6 straight lines in a swirl. You hand it back, and he grins. "Weather notice?" he says. "Expect drizzle and metaphors." You watch him disappear into the crowd, one more figure in a city without paper, carrying meaning in every step, stitch, chord, and whisper. The city doesn't panic anymore. It adapts, it sings, and as you drift homeward, guided by the quiet chatter of wind through knots and the gentle plunk of peas in soup, you realize this isn't just a workaround, it's a renaissance of remembering. You awaken to the scent of ink, or what your dreaming mind insists must be ink, though there's not a scroll in sight. What you're actually smelling is a mixture of pine soot, sandalwood, and fermented rice, subtle perfumes being used to recreate the sensory experience of a scriptorium. It's part of a new effort by the Tang court to maintain the atmosphere of record-keeping without the records themselves. Scented memory chambers, they're called. Rooms designed to make people feel like they're surrounded by documents, even if the only thing around is gentle music and calming aromas. You sit on a cushion and inhale deeply. One room smells of cold ink and warm tea. Another of fresh parchment that doesn't exist. It's all suggestion. But somehow, you feel more informed. Elsewhere, the Ministry of Ceremonies is experimenting with movement as decree. They've choreographed a series of hand gestures, small bows, and foot placements that, when performed in sequence, convey royal intent. The gesture for "all is well" looks suspiciously like an overcomplicated yawn. The gesture for urgent fiscal correction appears identical to a sneeze held in for too long. Court officials now spend half their time studying how not to miscommunicate through posture. One minister reportedly insulted the ambassador from Silla by accidentally miming, "Your boat is ridiculous," during a polite dinner stretch. Historians still argue whether this method improved diplomacy or just turned the royal court into a very elegant mime troupe. Either way, it's hard to look dignified while performing interpretive tax corrections. You pass a carpenter carving tiny patterns into window lattices, his own form of passive documentation. The number of crossbars? Number of meetings that day. A swirl at the top? Weather commentary? A tiny bird-shaped chip in the corner? Scandal? Possibly involving hairpins. He doesn't say a word, just nods and keeps carving. Further down the canal, a group of riverboat captains has taken to announcing news via oar patterns. You watch as a captain dips her paddle 3 times on the left, once on the right, then makes a sharp swirl. That means they've delayed the rice tax again, murmurs a bystander. Also, she's annoyed. It's oddly graceful, this language of water. Along the palace wall, a new tradition has formed. One that has no words, only glances. They call it the long look. Courtiers now communicate entire conversations through the duration and direction of their gaze. One long blink downward might mean, that proposal is doomed. A short glance left and a sigh. The treasurer fell asleep again. You try it with a passing scribe, offering a sympathetic squint and a subtle shrug. He responds with a half smile and a sideways nod that seems to say, "We're all pretending we understand the new budget." You feel seen. In the imperial menagerie, even the animals have joined in the experiment. A monkey has been trained to shuffle tiles bearing symbols. A crane delivers leaf bundles tied with messages to favored handlers. And a tortoise, long considered the slowest archivist, now carries a rotating shell cap on which messages can be painted, worn, then washed away. Today's tortoise shell reads, "The tax review committee has gone fishing." You nod. It tracks. As night deepens, you find yourself in the inkless archives, once the center of imperial documentation, now a vast echoing hall where former scribes recite key edicts from memory, their voices echoing softly like falling feathers. Each step you take through the stone hallway triggers a different phrase. One step. The spring planting begins on the 6th moon. Another step. Forgiveness shall be shown to all who misfiled their dates in good faith. It's like walking through a living scroll. You sit quietly and listen to one scribe murmur, "The emperor reserves the right to change his mind if a goose interrupts." You wonder if that was real or poetic license. Probably both. Nearby, a painter is illustrating daily events on long silk fans, an art form revived from the southern provinces. With each flick of the wrist, the day's messages unfurl. A marketplace fire, a birth in the eastern district, a surprise snowfall. It's delicate, ephemeral, and oddly calming. She hands you one, a blue fan depicting 3 chickens under a parasol. "It means unexpected harmony during an inspection," she says. You fan yourself and agree. Harmony, indeed. At the city's edge, as you walk the old southern wall, children are using kites to send word from rooftop to rooftop. Not paper kites, but cloth ones, with streamers dyed in specific bands. Red for celebration, green for caution, yellow for delays. You count 7 yellow kites and 1 red. It's unclear what's happening, but it's definitely happening with flair. Down the street, a baker has turned loaves into newsprint, sort of. Each loaf is scored with symbols before baking, turning every crust into a digest of the day. "This one says we ran out of cinnamon," the baker says proudly. "This one reports a rat sighting in the mayor's garden." You take a bite of the cinnamon loaf. It tastes informative. "Exactly," she beams. You finish your evening in the hush of the willow courtyard, where officials now float lotus petals in bowls to record approvals. A closed petal means denied. An open one, with honey dripped at the center, means approved and celebrated. "Tonight, most petals float open," someone whispers. "The emperor liked the dumpling proposal." Someone else. "He really liked the plum sauce." You smile and watch the petals drift slowly in the moonlit water, each one a quiet agreement, each one an offering to the future. And somewhere, beneath the flicker of torchlight, a musician tunes her lute to the cadence of the hour. She strums a chord you now recognize. It says, "Sleep well. The paper may be gone, but the story remains." The city is unusually hushed tonight. You pad softly across the palace stones, The echo of your steps muffled by the moss that creeps between tiles, a moss that a clever gardener has begun trimming into characters. This morning, the moss spelled peace. Yesterday it read, "Too many carrots." You wonder what the message will be tomorrow. Nap, you hope. Above you, paper lanterns drift gently in the breeze, each one containing no messages now, just the memory of them. They used to carry decrees, letters, poems. Now they float blank, glowing softly, a reminder that silence can hold history, too. You pass through the scribe's wing, now converted into a whisper gallery, where former clerks record short memories in hushed tones into clay jars, sealed with wax, and left on cool stone shelves. You pick one up, listen carefully through the lid. A woman's voice murmurs, "We once argued for 3 days over the word tolerable. It still makes me laugh." You seal the jar again, gently. Maybe someone else will hear it next year. Beyond the courtyard, you find a man using dyed silk cords to braid what he calls daily braille. He wraps them around door handles, 1 twist for trade, 2 for taxes, 3 for tea. You run your fingers over today's cord, soft, looped, a bit floral. Today, he says, means nothing's urgent. For the first time all day, you exhale. In the northwest quarter, children are making rain drums, pots and bowls turned upside down, catching drops from the roofs above. They listen to the rhythms, claiming they can hear stories in the patter. "This one says the goats are planning a rebellion," a child tells you solemnly. Another drum blurts out something that sounds suspiciously like, "We're out of plums." You sit beside them for a while, head tilted toward the rhythm, trying to hear what's not quite there. Across the city, a quiet revolution of forgetting begins. The paperless panic has passed. The stories have scattered into new forms, gestures, shadows, tastes, and tunes. But people remember them just the same. In a pottery shop, a woman paints images on bowls with glazes that vanish after washing. One depicts a cat stealing a diplomat's lunch. Another shows the emperor mistaking a decorative fan for an edible pancake. "They're private jokes," she says. "Messages that don't need to last." You buy one with a rabbit sitting on a stool, holding a stamp. "What does it mean?" you ask. She grins, probably approval. As you walk home, a breeze picks up, rustling the willow trees overhead. In their swaying branches, someone has knotted bits of ribbon, each a former message now too faded to read. But you don't need to. Their purpose is complete. Even unspoken, they whisper, "You were here. You remembered. You mattered." At last you return to the hillside garden, where 1,000 tiny candles flicker in shallow bowls. Each one is unmarked, unadorned. A ceremony of unwritten records. You light one, watch its flame steady, then you sit. The stars blink slowly overhead. The water glimmers. The goats are, presumably, at peace. You breathe in, full and quiet. No panic now, no shortage. Just a city that relearned how to remember. So now, here you are, at the edge of a forgotten panic, nestled in the soft hush of a civilization that found 1,000 ways to remember without paper. The Tang court, once gripped by the strange anxiety of disappearing scrolls, didn't collapse or crumble. It drifted, shifted, whispered, from knots in silk to songs in soup, from moss-shaped phrases to scent-wrapped apologies. The words still found their way. Like you just did, drifting through a city where history floats, not in ink, but in movement and spice and wind. And maybe that's what remembering really is. Not perfect preservation, but graceful improvisation. Maybe we never needed so many scrolls. Just enough to light the path back to one another. Just enough to leave a footprint of meaning, however soft. Tonight, as the last breeze slides along the rooftops and the final lantern winks low, you rest beside a world that didn't panic. Not for long. It adapted. It listened. It laughed a little. And then it kept going. So wherever you are, in your bed, curled under quiet covers, or gently dozing with one ear still tuned to history, know that your thoughts, too, matter. They ripple outward like a lotus petal on water. Felt, then gone. Then somehow, still here. Close your eyes now. Let the messages go quiet. Let the inkless memories do the rest. You're part of the story, and now it's time to dream. Good night.